It's August of 1914 in Britain. You hear the call to volunteer to join the British Army. You have heard the disturbing tales of the barbaric acts carried out on nuns and children by German soldiers, filling you with rage. Whilst all around you, posters instilled the idea of doing your fair share for your king and country. By all accounts, the war should be a quick one, over by Christmas. You and your friends from your hometown are eager for adventure, not wanting to miss out on something grand to tell your children one day. But the realities of modern warfare are far from what you could have ever imagined. From 1914 until 1919, the daily life for a soldier on the Western Front was a mix of fear, struggles, and boredom. The risk of death was always present, living in muddy conditions prone to illness, along with the constant threat of enemy attack. In today's video, we will look at the daily life of a British soldier fighting on the Western Front. World War I is synonymous with trench warfare, particularly on the Western Front, and for soldiers the trench network would be where they would call home. For the British, trenches were designed to be temporary structures, with new trenches to be quickly built after territory was recaptured. German trenches therefore tended to be bigger, deeper and more complex than the British and French. The German strategy was to hold the line and consolidate their captured territory, challenging the British and French to displace them. Trenches were often built with three lines: the front line, the support line and the reserve line. Should the front line be captured by the enemy, the support line would be used to launch a counterattack. Connecting these lines were communication trenches, allowing soldiers to run messages between. Trenches were built as a defence against rifle, machine gun and artillery fire. They were therefore not built in a straight line and could be 2 meters deep. The soldiers stood on a duckboard, planks of wood a few inches above the bottom of the trench to allow for some drainage. But in the hastily dug trenches, flooding occurred. The flooding meant that soldiers stood in stagnant, muddy water for hours at a time. Against the front wall of the trench would be a firing step, where the soldier would stand too, ready to fire at incoming enemy soldiers. The front of the trench would be protected by sandbags and barbed wire, and beyond the trench would be 250 meters or so of no man's land, the space between the opposing trenches. Often this space would be littered with artillery craters, deceptively deep and filled with water. Barbed wire and the remains of those men who could not be rescued littered the muddy, devastated terrain. No man's land was beyond eerie. Soldiers on the front line would be expected to remain in place for around 4 to 6 days before being allowed relative rest in the support or reserve lines. For those soldiers living on the front lines, the average day would begin in the early morning around dawn. The day would begin with the men of the section standing to. This would see the men fix bayonets to their rifles and mount the firing steps. Dawn saw a greater risk of enemy attack, and so the men of this section looked over the no man's land for any sign of attack. This would last until the day had broken, where most of the men would be allowed to stand down. Breakfast would then be served, which would be more varied than one might expect. Frontline soldiers faced a long, grueling day, so they were well fed, as many as 3,500 calories a day. The bulk of a soldier's diet would be made up of hardtack biscuits, which were inedible without soaking in water first, but bacon, bread, and large amounts of tea too were served. After breakfast, soldiers would be given their daily rum rations, which were stored in large ceramic jars labelled with SRD for the Supply Reserve Depot. But soldiers created their own acronyms, such as Seldom Reaches Destination, Soon Runs Dry, or Service Rum Diluted. After breakfast, soldiers would need to carry out their compulsory wash and shave. Hygiene in the trench was vital, as many were infested with lice and rats. The risk of trench foot was a real problem, as many had their feet wet or submerged in water for long periods of time. The effects of trench foot are beyond disturbing, with blood vessels constricting, leading to skin falling off, and in some extreme cases, those suffering with trench foot required amputation of the affected parts. Soldiers would check each other's feet to make sure that they were not showing any symptoms. Shaving too was vital, and more vital than you might expect, as beards and stubble could lead to ill-fitted gas masks. Soldiers had to be prepared to respond to gas attacks at any moment. Gas attacks of chlorine or mustard gas could leave a victim blinded or with blistered skin, so every possible step was taken to reduce casualties. When the soldiers weren't on their 2-hour shift on sentry duty, they would have time during the day to themselves and to maintaining their weapons. This would often see soldiers writing letters home or chatting to their comrades. But plenty of soldiers also created poetry, wrote of their experiences, and crafted trench art. This saw items commonly found in the trench, like bullets, scrap metal and shell casings, transformed into art. During the midday lull, the section would be visited by the platoon sergeant, checking to make sure that the soldiers were acting as instructed. Any sign of infractions would lead to punishments. For minor infractions, it could be a dock in pay, but for serious examples, like being asleep on duty, could see a soldier being sent to prison or sentenced to hard labour. But for even more serious infractions, such as cowardice or desertion, death was the punishment. If you were to run away in battle due to shell shock or any manner of psychological conditions, you would be killed. During the First World War, 346 British soldiers were executed by firing squad for all manner of crimes. The knowledge that certain infractions carried a heavy punishment doubtlessly weighed over the soldiers' heads. At noon, lunch would be served. Again, the staple food would be the hardtack biscuits and tinned corned beef. But so too were tinned vegetables, with all 3 ingredients combined to make a stew. The food was to be eaten cold on the front lines and was despised by those forced to eat the rations. Though the soldiers would sometimes use their military-issued Tommy's cooker, a small portable stove. By warming up their tinned vegetable and meat stew, the food could be somewhat bearable. Some soldiers would also receive care packages from loved ones, where they would receive warm clothing and cigarettes. Some British department stores even sold bundles to be sent to frontline soldiers. Infamously, Harrods sold a kit marketed towards officers to use on their downtime, which included a syringe, cocaine, and morphine. It was common that these care packages sent from home would be shared amongst the comrades, a key part of the brotherhood that formed in the most disturbing of conditions. As dusk set in and the evening begins, soldiers again would be required to stand to. All men of the section would again fix bayonets and man the parapets, watching for any signs of enemy attack. As darkness set in, soldiers on the front line would have to be on high alert. 3 men at a time took sentry duty, with a man rotating every hour. This meant that soldiers only had 3 hours at a time to try and get some rest and some sleep, and trying to sleep in such a condition when the enemy could come at any moment would be extremely hard. Soldiers would be aware that enemy patrols sneaking over no man's land armed with pistols and knives could come over at any second, raid the trenches, kill the defenders, and capture territory. But so too were the British soldiers expected to carry out raids. Armed with sacks of grenades, spiked clubs and rifles, you'd be expected to carry out raids on the enemy to inflict as many casualties as possible and to capture prisoners. This would be an extremely dangerous job, but many men would volunteer for such attacks, well aware of the danger. But night raids were just one of the dangers of life on the front line. One might be expected to go over the top as part of a massed assault on the enemy's position. You would be expected to run as fast as you can towards the enemy over no man's land, traversing the muddy craters, barbed wire, and the bodies of your friends, hoping to reach the enemy trench. All the while, enemy machine gun, rifle fire, and artillery massacred the people that you had grown close with. You would just have to keep running, hoping that you weren't next. Even when not taking part in these assaults, the men on the front lines were under constant threat. Enemy snipers were often on the lookout for those peeking their heads above the parapet. Enemy artillery would pound their positions, softening them up before an enemy attack of their own. Even the relative safety of a dugout could be short-lived. They were prone to collapse if an unlucky shell landed too nearby. Now, let's imagine that you were able to survive these horrors for a few years. The constant barrage would leave men with shell shock, otherwise known as PTSD. Some of the first recorded symptoms of shell shock included loss of vision, smell, hearing, and memory loss. Men would experience tremors, being unable to control their bodies, struggling to speak with stammers, and prone to panicked violence. As for the psychological symptoms, the soldiers often had feelings of helplessness, fear, panic, and anxiety. But most infamous of the symptoms were the nervous breakdowns, uncontrollable body movements. It is thought that the very nature of trench warfare contributed to these symptoms, trapped in a trench, facing the horrors of modern warfare, the likes of which the world had not seen yet. It's therefore not surprising that many of those who survived these conditions of war returned home completely broken. Many were left traumatized by the horrors of war, suffering with shell shock or PTSD. Others were left severely injured by the horrors of modern warfare. 1 in 4 British soldiers returned home wounded, with 1 in 7 with some form of life-changing injury. As many as 41,000 soldiers had limbs amputated due to the massive damage artillery shrapnel could cause and the risk of deadly infections. Innovations in prosthetics and plastic surgery allowed surgeons to recreate all manner of injuries, some of the most remarkable being the advancement in facial reconstruction. But for many who survived World War I physically altered, they were seen as other, as different, and as lesser. Many of the men struggled to find employment, instead taking up jobs away from the public eye. Many struggled to reconnect with their families and loved ones. Some would never leave the hospitals, well aware as to how they would be treated in the outside world. Now just imagine, you were told to go to war, that the war would be over quickly, and that it would be a good experience for you. You arrive only to witness a new kind of warfare. Your family, friends, fellow countrymen machine gunned down in front of you. You've seen rats feasting upon the flesh of those you care about. You've endured the skin on your feet literally falling off due to trench foot. You now have deep psychological issues which the world doesn't understand yet. And to top it all off, you're left with facial disfigurement, forever unable to live a normal life again. You sacrificed your life, body, and mind, and for what?